The camera clicked 7 times that morning, and Nora Bellwether was not in a single frame. She was 12 years old, standing at the top of the staircase in her stocking feet, watching her family arrange themselves in front of the fireplace like pieces on a chessboard nobody had asked her to play. Her father, Richard, sat in the wingback chair, his hand resting on the shoulder of his wife, Margaret. On the rug in front of them, cross-legged and giggling, were Claire and Thomas, Margaret's children, 7 and 9, in matching red sweaters that Nora had helped iron the night before. "Nora, honey, why don't you go finish getting ready?" Margaret had said, not quite looking at her. The photographer's only got a few more minutes before his next appointment. "I am ready," Nora said. She was already wearing the green dress her father had bought her for the occasion. She remembered touching the hem of it that morning, thinking it was pretty, thinking maybe this year would be different. "Oh, sweetheart, I just mean, we're doing the 4 of us this time. Family portrait for the mantle. We'll get you and your dad a nice one another day, just the 2 of you. That'll be special, won't it?" Nora looked at her father. He was already smiling for the camera, his eyes fixed somewhere past her, the way a man looks when he has decided, quietly and without cruelty, that a conversation is over before it begins. "Sure," Nora said. "That'll be special." She went back up the stairs before the flash went off. She sat on the top step, out of frame, out of sight, and listened to the photographer counting down, 3, 2, 1, and the small, satisfied laughter that followed, the sound of a family admiring itself. She did not cry that day. She would tell herself, years later, that this was the day she learned how to build a wall so quiet no one would ever hear it going up. To understand why Nora sat so easily on that step, you have to understand what came before it. Her mother, Ellen, had died when Nora was 5, a car accident on a wet October road that Nora remembered only in fragments, the specific yellow of her mother's raincoat, the smell of her shampoo, the particular way she used to sing off-key on purpose just to make Nora laugh in the bath. Nora did not remember the funeral at all. She remembered, instead, the year that followed it in strange, disconnected pieces, her father sitting at the kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold, staring at nothing, the neighbor who brought over casseroles every Tuesday for months without ever once being asked, the particular silence of a house built for 3 people that now only held 2. Richard Bellwether had been, by every account Nora ever heard, wildly in love with his wife, the kind of love people in that small town still talked about years later, half in admiration and half in pity for the man left holding it alone. He was not equipped for grief, not really. He worked longer hours. He forgot, more than once, to pack Nora's lunch, and covered the gap with money shoved into her hand for the vending machine instead, an apology disguised as convenience. He was, in every practical sense, still present. But some quieter, more essential part of him had gone missing right alongside Ellen, and it would be years, if ever, before Nora properly understood that Margaret had not stolen that part of her father away. It had simply never fully come back from the accident in the first place, and Margaret had unknowingly married what was left. Nora did not resent her father for grieving. She resented, quietly and for a very long time, that his grief seemed to have room in it for everyone except her, as though loving his daughter meant looking too closely at the woman she was starting to resemble, and looking away had simply become easier than looking at all. It happened again the next year. And the year after that. Each time, there was a reason, offered gently, like a small kindness. The photographer's schedule. The matching sweaters that only came in 3 sizes. A "will do you next time" promise that arrived so often it stopped sounding like a promise and started sounding like a weather report, an expected condition of the season, as reliable as snow. By the time Nora was 15, she'd stopped asking to be included. She'd learned to volunteer for something else instead: hot chocolate duty, ornament untangling. "I'll just get the door for Grandma Ellis," so that her absence from the photograph looked like a choice rather than what it actually was. Her father was not a cruel man. That was the part that took Nora the longest to understand, and the part that hurt the most once she did. Richard Bellwether was tired, and grieving in a way he never spoke of, and had married a woman 4 years after Nora's mother died because the house had gotten too quiet and Nora had gotten too much like her mother to look at some mornings. He loved his daughter. He simply loved her from a distance that grew, inch by inch, every December, until the distance became the shape of their whole relationship and neither of them remembered how to close it. "Dad," Nora said once, she was 16, catching him alone in the garage while he hunted for the box of ornaments, "can I ask you something?" "Course. Do you ever notice I'm not in any of the Christmas pictures?" He didn't stop rummaging through the box right away. When he did look up, his face did something complicated. A flicker of guilt quickly folded back into practicality, the way a man refolds a map he doesn't want to admit he's lost. "It's just, Margaret handles all that. The photographer, the poses, all of it. I don't think it's ever on purpose, nor. It's just logistics. It's happened 6 years in a row." "Has it been 6? He said it like a genuine question, and that was somehow worse than if he'd lied. "7, actually. Since I was 9. Richard set the box down. For a moment Nora thought he might actually say something true. Instead he reached out and squeezed her shoulder, the same gesture he'd been giving her since she was small, a gesture that used to mean "I see you," and now, she realized, only meant "please don't make this harder than it already is." "I'll talk to her," he said. He never did. Or if he did, it changed nothing, because the following December, Margaret again explained, kindly, reasonably, with the practiced ease of someone repeating a line she'd used so many times it had smoothed into truth, that the photographer only had time for the core 4. Nora went up the stairs. She sat on the same step. She was 16 years old and she understood, with the flat clarity of a door closing, that this was not going to change. Not because anyone hated her. Because nobody had ever decided she mattered enough to fight for. She left for college at 18 and told herself it was about the program, photography and visual arts, a small state school 4 hours north, chosen specifically because it was far enough that no one would ask her to come home for a long weekend. The irony of it did not escape her even then. She had spent her whole childhood standing just outside of frames, and now she wanted to spend her life building them. Her first photography professor, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Diane Foster, looked through Nora's first portfolio, mostly empty chairs, half-open doors, the backs of people's heads, and said the thing that would end up changing the entire shape of Nora's life. "You have a very particular eye," Diane said, flipping slowly through the prints. "You keep photographing the space around people instead of the people themselves. Most students do the opposite. Why do you think that is?" Nora, 20 years old by then, sitting in a cramped studio that smelled like Fixer and coffee, shrugged like it was nothing. "I guess I notice who's missing before I notice who's there." Diane didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she set the portfolio down, took off her glasses, and said, very simply, "That's not a flaw, Nora. That's a gift most photographers spend their whole careers trying to learn. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." It was such a small thing to say. Nora would think about it for the rest of her life, or Diane became something to Nora that she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite a mother, Nora was careful about that word, protective of the fact that she'd had a mother once, however briefly, and didn't want to hand the title carelessly to someone else, even someone she loved. But Diane was the first adult who asked Nora real questions and actually waited, for real answers. She kept a spare key under the frog statue by her back door and told Nora, the first week they knew each other, that's not just for emergencies. That's for whenever this feels more like home than wherever you're staying. It was in Diane's kitchen, over burnt grilled cheese, that Nora met Priya Anand, a fierce, funny nursing student who lived 2 doors down from Diane and had wandered over one night following the smell of burning bread, only to end up staying until 2 a.m. arguing about whether cereal counted as soup. Priya became the sister Nora never got to choose growing up, loud where Nora was quiet, reckless where Nora was careful, utterly unbothered by things that used to terrify Nora, like taking up space, like being loud in a room, like being seen. And then there was Mr. Eli Hargrove. He lived in the apartment below Nora's first place off campus, a retired high school history teacher with a bad hip and a worse habit of leaving his door propped open in case anyone needs anything, which nobody ever does, but you never know. Nora met him the week she moved in, when her ancient car battery died in the parking lot and he appeared with jumper cables and a thermos of coffee before she'd even finished swearing at the engine. "You're new," he said, not a question. "Just moved in." Nora. Eli. "Fair warning, I talk too much, I complain about my hip constantly, and I will absolutely notice if your lights are on at 3 a.m. more than twice a week and ask you about it." That's a lot of warning for one introduction. He grinned, missing one incisor, delighted. "I like to get the difficult parts out of the way early. Saves time." That first night, once the car was running again, Eli refused to simply disappear back into his apartment the way a stranger politely would. He insisted, instead, on carrying her groceries up the 2 flights of stairs himself, ignoring her protests about his hip entirely, and once they reached her door, he lingered a moment longer than necessary, studying the still unpacked boxes visible through the gap in the doorway. "You eaten today?" he asked, in the same brisk, no-nonsense tone he'd used to diagnose her dead battery. "I'm fine, really, that's not what I asked." He was already turning back toward the stairs. "There's a pot of something on my stove that's got about 6 more servings than one old man needs. Door's open if you change your mind. No pressure. Just don't let pride make you eat cereal for dinner on your first night in a new city, that's all I'm saying." She had gone down, eventually, embarrassed by how hungry she actually was, and found him exactly as promised, door propped open, a pot of something rich and herby simmering on the stove, a small black and white television playing an old film with the sound turned nearly all the way down. "I don't know your rules yet," she said, standing awkwardly in his doorway. "About space. Whether you actually want company or just felt obligated to offer." Eli looked up at her for a long moment, something in his face going briefly, unexpectedly serious. "Kiddo, I've lived alone in this building for 11 years. Nobody offers to fill a quiet apartment out of obligation. Sit down. Eat. We can work out the rules as we go." He became, over the following 4 years, something between a grandfather and a conscience. He was the one who noticed, that first November away from home, that Nora's mood dropped the closer Christmas got, though she never said why. He didn't push. He simply started inviting her down for what he called terrible television and worse cookies every Sunday in December, no explanation required, no story owed. It was Eli who first said the words that would become, quietly, the compass of Nora's adult life. "Family," he told her one Sunday, feet up on a milk crate, a rerun of some old western droning in the background, "isn't the people who happen to share your blood, kiddo. Blood's just plumbing. Family's the people who show up. That's the whole test." Not who loves you the most, who shows up. You'll learn that's rarer than it sounds. By 26, Nora had built a life so full it sometimes startled her. She'd taken a job as a staff photographer for a small but well-regarded magazine, the kind that covered weddings and town festivals and the occasional heartbreaking obituary spread for a beloved local figure. Diane had become less her mentor and more her friend, though she still called Nora kid and still critiqued her photos with the same unsparing honesty she'd used the very first day. Priya had become a labor and delivery nurse, and had a habit of showing up at Nora's apartment at odd hours after brutal shifts, flopping onto Nora's couch and saying nothing at all for 20 minutes before eventually starting to talk. Nora had learned to just let the silence sit there until Priya was ready, the same patience Eli had once shown her. Eli, now in his late 70s, had slowed down considerably, but still called every Thursday at exactly 6 p.m., still complained about his hip, still ended every single call the same way, "All right. Love you. Don't stay up too late editing pictures of strangers' weddings instead of living your own life." And there was Jonah. Jonah Reyes had wandered into Nora's life sideways, the way the best things always seemed to. He was a contractor hired to redo the flooring in the magazine's office, and he'd found Nora eating lunch alone in the stairwell because the break room was too loud, and instead of leaving her be, he'd sat down on the step below her and said, "This is either the loneliest lunch spot in the building or the smartest one. I can't decide." "Bit of both," she'd said. "Mind if I test the theory?" He'd been testing the theory for 3 years now. He was steady in a way that had, at first, made Nora deeply suspicious. She kept waiting for the catch, the eventual reason he'd start looking past her the way her father once had. The catch never came. Jonah simply stayed. He learned, without being told the full story, that December was hard for her, and he never once asked her to explain why before he was willing to make it easier. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said once, early on, when she'd gone quiet during a Christmas movie for no reason she could name. "You just have to let me sit here while you're quiet." That's allowed too. Nora had cried a little that night, and he'd let her, and neither of them made a big thing of it, and that, more than anything he could have said, was what told her he was different. There was another moment, about a year into knowing him, that Nora kept returning to whenever she doubted whether she'd finally gotten it right. Jonah had invited her to a family gathering of his own, a boisterous, chaotic barbecue with cousins and nieces and an uncle who insisted on grilling everything, including foods that had no business being grilled. Nora had gone tense almost immediately, some old instinct bracing itself for the particular kind of exclusion she still expected from any family, even one that wasn't hers. She noticed, though, as the afternoon wore on, that Jonah kept finding small, unshowy ways to make sure she was woven properly into it, introducing her by name to every single relative rather than the vague "this is my friend," pulling her chair into the center of the group photo his mother insisted on taking before dessert, catching her eye across the yard more than once with a small, checking-in smile that asked nothing except "Are you all right?" without ever needing the words. "You didn't have to do all that," she told him afterward, in the car, still slightly stunned by how easy the whole afternoon had felt. "Do all what?" "Make sure I was in the photo. Introduce me properly every single time." "I noticed, Jonah." He'd glanced over at her, surprised she'd even needed to name it. "Of course I did. Why wouldn't I?" It was such a small, unremarkable question to him, and it undid something in Nora's chest all the same, because for 15 years, the answer to "why wouldn't I" had apparently required quite a lot of explaining in her father's house, and here it was, offered without a second thought, as though it had never once occurred to Jonah that the answer could be anything other than obvious. She had, by 26, an entire family. Diane and her sharp eye. Priya and her fierce loyalty. Eli and his Thursday calls. Jonah and his steady, undemanding presence. None of them shared her blood. All of them, in Eli's words, had shown up, not once, but again and again, in the unglamorous, unphotographed moments that never made it onto anyone's mantle. She hadn't spoken to her father in almost 2 years. She sent a card at Christmas, out of some stubborn residue of hope she couldn't quite kill. He sent one back, always a week late, always signed simply Dad, never love. The call came on a Tuesday in early November, an unfamiliar area code that turned out, when Nora answered out of sheer curiosity, to belong to her stepmother. Nora? It's Margaret. Nora sat very still at her desk, the phone against her ear, a half-edited photograph frozen on her monitor, a bride laughing so hard she'd knocked her own veil askew. Margaret. Is everything okay? Is Dad, your father's fine? Everyone's fine. A pause, longer than it needed to be. I'm calling about Christmas. Something in Nora's chest went very cold, very fast, an old and familiar bracing. Your grandmother, Grandma Ellis, she's not doing well, Nora. The doctors think this might be her last Christmas. And she's been talking, lately, about the family photo. All of us. She's got this idea in her head about wanting one more, everyone together, hanging in her room at the care facility. Another pause. She asked about you specifically. She said, and I'm quoting her, "Where's my Nora? I want my Nora in the picture this year." Nora had to set her coffee down because her hand had started, very slightly, to shake. She's been asking for you, Margaret went on, when Nora didn't speak. For years, actually. I don't know if you knew that. No, Nora said quietly. I didn't know that. So, we were hoping. Your dad was hoping. That you'd come for the 23rd. We're doing the photo that morning, before everyone scatters for actual Christmas Day plans. It would mean so much to her. To all of us, really. To all of us. Nora almost laughed, except it wasn't funny, it had never once been funny, the way that phrase kept being offered to her a decade and a half too late, like a coupon that had long since expired but someone was still trying to use at the register. I'll think about it, Nora said, and hung up before her voice could do anything humiliating. She sat at her desk for a long while after that, the bride still frozen on her monitor mid-laugh, they'll ask you, and found herself, almost against her will, cataloging every Christmas photograph she'd never been in, the way she might catalog a portfolio, the year of the matching sweaters, the year of the core four, the year Margaret had actually apologized in advance, before Nora had even asked, as though preempting the disappointment somehow made it kinder. 15 photographs, more or less, each one hanging somewhere in that house, on a mantel or in a hallway or tucked into a Christmas card sent out to relatives who'd long since stopped asking where the older daughter had got to. She thought about the version of herself who used to volunteer for hot chocolate duty, who had gotten so skilled at disappearing gracefully that nobody had ever needed to feel the discomfort of actively excluding her. She wondered, sitting there, whether that skill had ever really left her, or whether it was simply waiting, patient as ever, for the next room that required it. Underscore 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 underscore, she told Jonah first, that night, sitting cross-legged on his kitchen floor because the movers hadn't yet delivered his kitchen table and neither of them had felt like waiting for chairs to have this conversation. They want me in the photo, she said, turning her mug slowly between her palms. After everything. After 15 years of finding reasons I couldn't be. Now suddenly there's room. How do you feel about that? Furious, Nora said immediately, surprising herself with how fast it came. And then guilty for being furious, because my grandmother is dying and she's the one person in that whole family who never once made me feel like an afterthought. And then furious again, because why does it take somebody dying for them to remember I exist? Jonah didn't try to smooth any of it over, didn't offer easy comfort. He just nodded slowly, like he was actually turning her words over instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Can I ask you something, and you can tell me to shut up if it's not helpful? Go ahead. What do you actually want? Not what would be fair. Not what would prove a point. What do you, Nora, actually want to happen on December 23rd? Nora opened her mouth to answer and found, for the first time in 15 years, that she genuinely didn't know. She called Eli next, because some questions could only be asked to someone who'd already lived through most of the answers. You should go see your grandmother, Eli said, without hesitation, the moment Nora finished explaining. Whatever you decide about the photo, go see her. That part isn't complicated. The woman asked for you by name. You go. And the photo? That's a different question entirely, and it's yours to answer, not mine. But don't let the family's guilt about the picture stop you from getting time with a woman who might not have much of it left. Don't let their mess cost you something that's actually yours to keep. So Nora went to see her grandmother alone, 3 days before the family gathering, on a gray Thursday afternoon that smelled like antiseptic and the particular sweetness of the peppermints Grandma Ellis kept in a dish by her bed, the same dish she'd kept them in for as long as Nora could remember. There she is, Grandma Ellis said, when Nora appeared in the doorway, her voice thin but her eyes sharp as ever. My Nora. Come here, let me look at you properly. Nora crossed the small room and took the old woman's hand, papery and cool, and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. I hear you're the one who wanted me in this photo, Nora said, keeping her voice light, though something in her throat had gone tight. I wanted you in every photo, Grandma Ellis said, matter of fact, no apology in it, just plain fact laid on the table between them. I thought about it more than once, you know. With Margaret. With your father, God love him, useless as he can be about these things. I never won. I'm sorry for that. I should have fought harder. Nora hadn't expected the confession, and it undid something in her chest she'd spent years bracing shut. I always wondered if anyone noticed, Nora said quietly. I noticed every single year, Grandma Ellis said. I noticed, and I said something, and it never changed anything, and I let that be enough, and it wasn't enough, and I'm telling you that now because I don't have the luxury of time to keep pretending otherwise. She squeezed Nora's hand, surprising strength for someone so small in that bed. You don't owe that photograph anything, sweetheart. Not this year, not any year. But I would very much like to see your face again before I go, in whatever way you're willing to give it to me. That's the only thing I actually want. The picture was never really about the picture. Nora sat with her grandmother for 2 more hours that afternoon, and for the first time in a very long time, she cried in front of a member of her own family, and it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like something finally being let down after being held up for far too long. She spent the 3 days between that visit and the 23rd turning Jonah's question over in her mind, again and again, at odd hours, while editing photographs, while standing in line at the grocery store, while lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at a ceiling that offered no answers. What do you actually want to happen? She had not, in the end, arrived at a clean answer. But somewhere in the driving itself, 3 hours south, the same stretch of highway she'd driven 100 times before, past the same water tower with the faded town name, the same diner where she and her father used to stop for milkshakes when she was very small, before Margaret, before any of it, something in her settled into a kind of clarity that felt less like a decision and more like simply, finally, admitting what had already been true for years. She did not want the photograph. She had known that, somewhere underneath the fury, since the moment Margaret first called. What she wanted, she realized somewhere around mile marker 40, was something the photograph could never actually give her, an honest reckoning, spoken out loud, in the room where the harm had happened, rather than politely swallowed the way every other Christmas had required. She thought about Eli's voice on the phone. Don't let their mess cost you something that's actually yours to keep. She thought about her grandmother's papery hand in hers. The picture was never really about the picture. She thought, more than anything, about the version of herself who used to sit on that top step, telling herself it was fine, and she made herself a quiet promise, somewhere on that highway, that whatever happened in that living room, she would not leave it having shrunk herself smaller to make the moment easier for anyone else. By the time she pulled into the familiar street, hands steady on the wheel in a way they hadn't been in years, she understood that she was not driving toward forgiveness, and she was not driving toward punishment either. She was driving toward the truth, plainly spoken, for the first time in 15 years, and whatever came after that would simply have to be whatever it actually was, rather than whatever kept the peace most conveniently. The house looked exactly the same. That was, somehow, the most disorienting part. The wreath on the door was a different color, the porch light had been replaced, but the bones of the place were unchanged, and Nora felt 16 again the moment she stepped out of her car, 12 again, 9 again, every version of herself that had ever stood on this porch waiting to be let all the way in. Margaret opened the door before Nora could knock, her face arranging itself into something that was trying very hard to be warmth. Nora. You came. I said I would. Everyone's inside. Your father's, well, he's nervous, if I'm honest. He's been nervous all week. Nora stepped past her into the front hall, and there it was, the same fireplace, the same rug, the same wingback chair, all of it staged again for another photograph, another mantle, another version of a family that had, for 15 years, quietly agreed she wasn't quite part of the set. Claire and Thomas, grown now, 22 and 24, stood awkwardly by the tree, clearly briefed on the delicacy of the occasion, clearly unsure what to say to a sister they barely knew. Richard stood by the window, and when he turned and saw Nora, something crumpled in his face, old and tired and finally afraid of losing something rather than merely comfortable with having already lost it. Nora. His voice cracked on the single syllable. You look so much like your mother. I know, Nora said. You've told me that before. Usually right before you look away. The room went very quiet. Claire glanced at Thomas. Margaret's hand fluttered toward her own collarbone, a nervous, betraying gesture. I'm not here to make this hard, Nora said, and she meant it, though her voice shook slightly on the words. I'm here because Grandma Ellis asked for me, and because she's the one person in this house who never once made me feel like a mistake that had to be managed. I came for her. Nora, please, Richard said, crossing the room toward her. I know I failed you. I've known it for years and I never said it because saying it meant admitting it, and admitting it meant admitting there's no fixing 15 years in one photograph. But I want to try. Please. Stay for the picture. Let us have this one, at least. Nora looked at her father, really looked at him, at the deep lines that 15 years of quiet cowardice had carved into a face she used to think was the safest place in the world. "Do you know what I used to do?" Nora said, "every single time this happened? I used to go sit on the top step. Out of frame. And I used to tell myself it was fine, because making a scene would only make things worse, and I already knew, even at 9 years old, that I wasn't worth the scene to anyone else in this house. I built an entire personality out of not being any trouble. Out of shrinking so small nobody would ever have to actively decide to leave me out, I'd just already be gone. Nora, I'm not finished." Her voice was steady now, steadier than she expected. "I found people who never once made me sit on a step. Not one time. Not once did any of them look past me the way you did every single December for 15 years. And I am not interested in blaming you for the rest of my life, Dad, because that's its own kind of trap, and I've spent enough of my life shaped by what this family didn't give me. But I'm not going to stand in that photograph today and pretend 15 years erased itself because Grandma got sick and you finally got scared enough to be brave." The room was silent except for the low murmur of a Christmas carol still playing from a speaker somewhere, absurdly cheerful against the weight of the moment. "So I'm going to go see Grandma Ellis," Nora continued, softer now, no longer aiming to wound, simply telling the truth. "And then I'm going to go spend Christmas with the people who taught me what the word family actually means when nobody's forcing them to use it. And I genuinely hope, that someday you and I figure out how to be something to each other again. But it isn't going to happen today, in front of a camera, for a photo that was never really about me to begin with." Margaret's eyes were wet. Claire had turned fully away, hand pressed to her mouth. Thomas simply stared at the floor, the way people do when they realize, too late, that a wrong they never chose still cost someone else everything. It was Claire, unexpectedly, who spoke next, her voice thick and unsteady. "I used to think it was normal," she said, still not quite turning around. "Growing up, I mean. I never thought to question it, because it was just how things had always been, before I was even old enough to remember differently. I don't think I understood, until right now, standing here, exactly what that must have looked like from where you were sitting. On the stairs. I'm so sorry, Nora. I don't know what else there is to say." "You were a child too, Claire," Nora said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it without bitterness. "I don't hold this against you and Thomas. You didn't build the house. You just grew up inside it, same as I did, just in a different room of it than me. That doesn't make it feel any less awful, knowing now." "No," Nora agreed. "I don't imagine it does." Richard didn't argue. He nodded, slowly, his eyes bright and unsteady. "Okay," he said. "Okay. That's fair, Nora. That's more than fair." "I love you," Nora said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was still true, even now, even after everything. "I don't know how to fix this. But I don't hate you. I want you to know that." She hugged her father, briefly, and felt him hold on a beat too long, the way people do when they suspect an ending is closer than they're ready for. Then she turned, and drove to see her grandmother one more time, and afterward, she drove north, back to the people who had never once needed a reason to let her all the way in. Diane's house was lit up like something out of a postcard when Nora pulled into the driveway that evening, string lights along the porch railing, a wreath that Priya had absolutely made herself and insisted, loudly, was modern art, not a mess, and through the front window, the unmistakable silhouette of Eli asleep in an armchair with his mouth slightly open, a paper crown from some long-forgotten cracker still perched crookedly on his head. Nora sat in the car for a moment before going in, just looking at the warm light spilling out into the cold evening, and let herself feel, without flinching away from it, exactly how much she had built. Priya flung the door open before Nora even reached the porch steps. "There she is. We saved you a plate, and also an argument about whether pineapple belongs on ham, and also," she stopped, taking in Nora's face properly. "Hey. You okay?" "I will be," Nora said, and meant it. Inside, Diane was pulling something out of the oven that smelled like it was one confident step away from being burnt, and Jonah was on the floor by the fireplace, untangling a knot of lights with the patient stubbornness of a man who refused to simply buy a new string. "Hey, you," Jonah said, looking up, his whole face changing the way it always did when she walked into a room, like she was still somehow a surprise to him after 3 years. "How'd it go?" "I said what I needed to say," Nora said. "I saw my grandmother. I didn't stay for the picture." "Good," Eli said from the armchair, not even opening his eyes, apparently not as asleep as he'd looked. "Picture never mattered anyway. You know that now, I hope." Nora crossed the room and sat down on the arm of his chair, and he reached up without looking and patted her hand, twice. The same gesture he'd been giving her since she was 18 years old and terrified of a dead car battery in a cold parking lot. "I do know that now," she said. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway, oven mitts still on, and looked at Nora for a long moment with the same sharp, assessing eye she'd used on that very first portfolio full of empty chairs and half-open doors. "You know," Diane said, "all those years you spent photographing the space around people instead of the people themselves, I used to wonder what you were really looking for in those pictures. And now? Now I think you were photographing the shape of what was missing. So you'd recognize it, later, if you ever found the thing that was supposed to fill it." Diane smiled, something soft breaking through her usual sharpness. "Looks like you found it." They ate together at Diane's small kitchen table, all 5 of them crowded around a surface built for 4, elbows bumping, Priya still relitigating the pineapple on ham debate with a fervor entirely disproportionate to the subject, Eli complaining, with evident relish, about the state of his hip in the cold weather, Jonah's leg pressed warm against Nora's under the table the entire meal, a small, steady point of contact she found herself returning to all evening, the way a person checks a pulse. Nobody asked her to retell the whole conversation from the Bellwether house. Diane simply refilled her glass without comment. Priya, sensing without being told exactly how much detail was welcome, kept the conversation moving toward lighter things, an outrageous patient story from her last shift, a ridiculous mix-up over the wreath Priya had made that had apparently caused a minor dispute with a neighbor who'd assumed it was store-bought and asked, with some offense, why Priya hadn't simply bought a nicer one. "I made that with my own 2 hands, Brenda," Priya recounted, in an aggrieved imitation of her own earlier outrage, "and you're telling me it looks like I didn't try?" The table dissolved into laughter, Nora's included, easy and unforced, and she thought, somewhere in the middle of it, how strange it was that a single evening could hold both the hardest conversation she'd had in 15 years and this ordinary, overlapping, elbow-bumping warmth, without either one canceling the other out. It was Priya's idea, an hour later, half a glass of wine into the evening, to take a picture. "Come on," she said, already fumbling with her phone, everybody in front of the fireplace. "Eli, wake up, this is not optional." "I wasn't asleep," Eli said, opening one eye. "I was resting my eyes very intensely." They arranged themselves in front of Diane's fireplace, not because anyone had planned it, not because a photographer's schedule demanded it, not because anyone needed to explain why there was exactly enough room for everyone this time. Diane stood on one side with her arms slung easily around Nora's shoulders. Priya crouched in front, holding the phone out at arm's length, laughing already at some joke only she'd heard. Jonah stood close behind Nora, his hand resting, warm and unhurried, at the small of her back. Eli sat in his armchair at the edge of the frame, paper crown crooked, grinning his gap-toothed grin, refusing every request to take it off. "Everybody in," Priya announced. "Everybody." "No, Eli, you're in the shot, stop trying to scoot out of frame, I can see you scooting." "I'm not scooting." "You are absolutely scooting." "Fine. Fine. I'm in the picture." "Happy?" "Ecstatic," Priya said. "Okay, 3, 2, 1, the flash went off, and this time, for the first time in 15 years, Nora Bellwether was standing directly in the center of the frame, not hovering at its edge, not caught halfway up a staircase, not folded quietly out of sight to spare anyone the trouble of making room. She was there, laughing at something Eli had just muttered under his breath about the indignity of paper crowns, Jonah's hand steady against her back, Diane's arm firm around her shoulders, and she realized, looking at the photo Priya immediately held up for everyone to inspect, that this was the first Christmas photograph in her entire life that she actually recognized herself in. Not because of how she looked. Because of how she felt, standing there. Wanted. Unquestioned. Simply, plainly included, without anyone having to decide it was worth the trouble. Grandma Ellis passed away in late January, peacefully, in her sleep, 3 weeks after that Christmas. Nora spoke at the funeral, the first time she'd stood in front of that entire extended family since the day she'd walked out of the living room and driven north instead of staying for a photograph. "My grandmother," Nora said, standing at the small podium, her father in the front row with his eyes fixed on her the entire time, no longer looking past her towards some point over her shoulder, was the only person in this family who ever fought for me to be seen. She didn't always win that fight. But she never once stopped having it. And I think, in the end, that's the whole difference between loving someone and merely keeping them. You have to be willing to fight for the space they take up in your life, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you something." After the service, her father found her by the car. "I've started seeing someone," Richard said, awkwardly, meaning a therapist, not a person, and Nora understood immediately and felt something loosen in her chest at the admission. "Trying to understand why I let it get so far. Why I let 15 years happen instead of one uncomfortable conversation at the start." "That's good, Dad. I'm not asking you to forgive me on any particular schedule," he said. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying. Actually trying. Not because Mom's gone," he still called Grandma Ellis Mom, some habits outliving even grief, "but because I don't want to run out of time the way she did, still waiting for me to get it right." Nora looked at her father for a long moment, and thought about all the versions of this conversation she used to imagine having, all the anger she'd rehearsed and never gotten to spend, and found that what was left, standing in a cold parking lot after her grandmother's funeral, was something quieter and more durable than anger. Something almost like hope, small and cautious, but real. "I'd like that," she said. Slowly. "But yes." That following December, Nora hung 2 photographs on her own mantel for the first time in her life. The first was small, black and white, a photograph she'd found in her grandmother's things after the funeral, Nora at 4 years old, sitting on Grandma Ellis's lap, both of them laughing at something lost now to time, taken years before Margaret, before Claire and Thomas, before the staircase, before any of it. Proof that somebody, once, had wanted her in the picture without needing to be asked twice. The second was the one Priya had taken that Christmas night, Nora at the center of the frame, Diane's arm around her shoulders, Jonah's hand at her back, Eli's paper crown crooked and ridiculous at the edge of the shot, every single person in it there because they had chosen, again and again, ordinary Tuesday after ordinary Tuesday, to show up. She had learned, finally, the thing her grandmother had tried to tell her in that quiet room that smelled of peppermints. The picture was never really about the picture. It never had been. It was about who stood close enough to be caught in the same light as you, and who considered that closeness worth the trouble. For 15 years, Nora Bellwether had been the one standing just outside the frame, waiting for someone to decide she belonged in it. She never had to wait for that again. She had simply built a family of people who never once let her stand outside a frame in the first place, and in the end, that was the only photograph that had ever really mattered. 2 years after that Christmas, Jonah proposed in the single least dramatic way imaginable, which Nora would later say was exactly, perfectly right for the two of them. They were on Diane's kitchen floor again. The table had, admittedly, finally arrived at some point in the intervening years, but old habits held, and they still ended up on the floor most evenings out of pure sentiment more than necessity, sorting through a box of old photographs Diane had asked Nora to help digitize for an exhibition. Nora had pulled out a print from years earlier, one of her very first assignments, an empty porch swing photographed just after a rainstorm, and was explaining to Jonah, half laughing at her own younger self, why she'd once found an empty swing more interesting than any person could possibly be. "I used to think that was the whole point of a good photograph," she said. "Showing the shape of an absence. Now I don't know. I think I might actually prefer photographs with people in them these days." "Funny you should say that," Jonas said, and when she looked up from the print, he was already down on one knee on Diane's kitchen floor, no ring box, just a plain gold band held loosely between two fingers, his voice steady but his hands, she noticed, very slightly not. "I don't have a speech," he admitted. "I've had 2 years to write one and I never managed it, because every time I tried, it came out sounding like I was trying to convince you of something, and I don't want to convince you of anything, Nora. I just want to ask you something plainly, the way you deserve to be asked things. Will you marry me? Not because it fixes anything. Just because I'd like to spend the rest of my life being one more person who shows up." Nora laughed, and cried a little, both at once, in the particular tangled way she'd learned, over the years, that both things could genuinely coexist without canceling each other out. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." From the next room came the unmistakable sound of Priya, who had clearly been eavesdropping the entire time, letting out a whoop loud enough to wake the whole street, followed almost immediately by Eli's dry, satisfied voice. Finally, Eli called through the doorway. "I was starting to think I'd need to intervene myself." "You were not going to intervene, Eli," Diane called back, laughing. "I absolutely was. I had a whole speech planned." Nora's better off never hearing it. Nora married Jonah the following autumn, in Diane's back garden, under the same string lights that had lit the porch that Christmas 2 years earlier. Her father walked her partway down the makeshift aisle. They had, by then, built something careful and real between them, not fully healed, never quite what it might have been if 15 years had gone differently, but honest, at least, and steady, and improving in the slow, unglamorous way real repair actually happens. He handed her off, at the halfway point, to Eli, who walked the rest of the way beside her, paper crown nowhere in sight but a boutonniere pinned slightly crooked to his lapel regardless, because some things about a man simply never change. Diane took the wedding photographs herself, refusing to hand the job to anyone else, and later, when Nora asked to see her favorite from the whole day, Diane pulled up a shot that wasn't of Nora and Jonah at all, but of the entire assembled group at the reception, Diane's sharp eye, Priya's fierce grin, Eli's gap-toothed delight, Jonah's steady hand at the small of Nora's back, and Nora herself, dead center, laughing at something lost now to time, exactly the way she had been in that first photograph Priya had ever taken of them, years before, on an ordinary Christmas night that had turned out, in the end, to be the most important one of her entire life.